Salvete, omnes. Today we are going to be talking about indirect statements, which are a type of subordinate clause. So, what is an indirect statement? An indirect statement is a subordinate clause that follows verbs of hearing, sensing, thinking, and saying. So a good way to remember this is the verbs that are usually associated with the head. So saying, smelling, seeing, hearing, thinking, sensing, feeling, etc., etc. Right? So they're all very sensory verbs. And it's a subordinate clause. Well, what does that mean? So a main clause can be by itself, right? I am a girl is a main clause, and when you have more than one verb in a sentence, it can either be two main clauses that are connected with a conjunction, I am a girl and I like tea, or that clause can be subordinated into the main clause. I am a girl who likes tea, right? Now, the key characteristic of a subordinate clause is that it can't stand on its own without the main clause, right? So, I like tea, as in I am a girl and I like tea, the clause I like tea can stand on its own. But if I said the sentence, I am a girl who likes tea cannot stand on its own unless it's a question. Who likes tea? Right? But not in the sense that I, the person, am liking tea. So basically the difference between a main clause and a subordinate clause is that a main clause can stand on its own, whereas a subordinate clause cannot stand on its own. So a direct statement is, you will never guess, something that's said directly. I smell roses in bloom. An indirect statement means that the statement is being filtered somehow, right? So it's being reported or it's being filtered. So I smelt that the roses were in bloom, right? So here what we've done is we've subordinated the roses were in bloom to a filtering head word. I smelt the fact that the roses were in bloom. So another example of direct versus indirect would be, the pasta is delicious, the girl said, is a direct statement because it's directly quoting the speech, whereas an indirect statement would be, or the way that you would make that sentence into an indirect statement is, the girl said, again, a verb of saying, that the pasta was delicious. So again, rather than getting the direct statement, you're getting the statement filtered. And in English, we use the word that to indicate that we're switching from the main clause into the subordinate clause. Okay, so that's how English forms indirect statements, but how does Latin form an indirect statement, which is probably a bit more important. So Latin forms an indirect statement using 5 key things. So first thing is going to be the head verb, which, yes, is a double innuendo. It's head because it's usually got something to do with the head, but it's also head because it's the main verb. It's the verb of the main clause, and it can stand by itself. Then the actual indirect statement is going to be made up of a subject accusative, an object accusative, rest, as in, there might be a prepositional phrase in there might be a dative or an ablative in there, a genitive, and then finally, you're going to have the infinitive. Now, the reason why I bolded head verb and infinitive is that those are actually the only 2 things that you need to make an indirect statement, right? The 3 in the middle are optional, because as we know, verbs can have an implied subject, right? So if it was the subject of the head verb was also the subject of the indirect statement, the author in Latin wouldn't necessarily feel the need to reiterate that by putting in a subject accusative. Now, what you will probably notice if this is the first time that you've been dealing with indirect statements, is that the subject is in the accusative and not in the nominative, right? So this is the key, well, that and the fact that the verb goes into the infinitive, that's the key thing that makes indirect statements different and difficult for Latin students. The subject will not be in the nominative, it will be in the accusative. And obviously the object will still be in the accusative. So that's why instead of saying accusative, we call it the subject accusative and the object accusative. But it makes it very tricky because they're going to be in the same case. So this is an example of an indirect statement in Latin. Dicit metrem rosas e dare, right? So as you can see, we've got the head verb, dicit. We have got a subject, which is in the accusative, matrem. We've got the object, which is also in the accusative, rosas. Then we've got something that we might classify as the rest. So we've got a dative, an indirect object. And then we've got the infinitive, which is dare. Now, obviously, in English, we don't translate indirect statements like their infinitives, because that's just not the way that English forms an indirect statement, right? So the best way to translate an indirect statement is to translate the head verb, so she said, then we insert a that, and then in your mind, you need to say that, okay, the grammar resets. We're now in the subordinate clause. So the subject accusative bit now becomes the subject of the sentence, her mother. The infinitive now becomes a normal verb, gave. Then you translate the object, roses, and then you translate anything else in the sentence that's left over. So we had to her. And that's how we get to, she said that her mother gave roses to her. Okay, so there's a few rules that we need to remember about indirect statements. So the first one is that the infinitive can be present, perfect, or future intense, right? And there is a thing called the historic present infinitive, which you can look up if you are particularly interested. But those are the three tenses that are going to appear in indirect statements. Periphrastic infinitives will agree with the subject accusative. Now, if you don't know what periphrastic means, I do have a video on that. But basically, it just means that it's going to be made up of a participle and the verb to be in the infinitive. And those two words together create the infinitive. But because we have the participle with the infinitive form of the verb to be, the participle is going to go into the accusative because it's going to be agreeing with the subject. And then it'll either be singular or plural, and then masculine, feminine, or neuter, depending on what the subject of the indirect statement is. Se and suis, which are both reflexive pronouns, so referring back to a person, I wash myself. Se and suis can only refer to the subject of the head verb. So this is very important. So se will only be referring back to the subject of the verb in the main clause. If the subject changes from the main clause to the subordinate clause, then the author is going to signpost that with a regular preposition, right? Not a reflexive preposition. And then finally, we've got the verb negare, which means I deny. And negare can often come up in indirect statements, and it's translated in a very specific way, right? So you will translate it as dicit, as to say for the head verb, but it's important to remember that unlike dicit, it is going, dico, dicere, it is going to be negating the indirect statement as well. So if I said negavit salvere, it actually should be he, she, or it said that he, she, or it was not well. So we translate the nego as said and then not. It's also negating the subordinate clause. Okay, so how do we actually find and translate indirect statements? Well, the first step is obviously you need to identify it. So to identify an indirect statement, you want to look for head verbs that are associated with indirect statements. That's probably the easiest thing, is to become familiar with the sorts of verbs that trigger indirect statements, right? Like dico and nego are very often, or I hear, or I think, are all, whenever you read that in Latin, you should be looking out for an indirect statement, because those are the sorts of verbs that often are used in conjunction with indirect statements. So another tip-off is if you're reading through the sentence and you feel like there's an unexplained infinitive or there's too many accusatives. So if you're looking at an infinitive and you don't think that it would work in English as an infinitive, right? I love to swim, right? If it's I said to swim, that does not make as much sense, right? In which case, maybe you could think that, okay, maybe it's an indirect statement. I said that I was swimming, right? So if the infinitive doesn't make sense, or if there's just a lot of accusatives in a sentence in conjunction with an infinitive, then you might be looking at an indirect statement. But obviously, the first thing that you need to do is identify that that is indeed the type of subordinate clause that you're looking for. So once you've identified that you're dealing with an indirect statement, it's important to mark up the clause into the 5 elements of an indirect statement that we discussed just beforehand. So the head verb, the subject accusative, the object accusative, the rest, and then the verb in the infinitive. So a good way to remember the 5 different elements of an indirect statement is that savior. So obviously here the SA is standing for subject accusative, the VI is standing for verb infinitive, the OA is standing for object accusative, and then the R is standing for rest. And then what's also good about this little acronym memory trick is that that's actually the way that we're going to be translating it into English, right? Subject, verb, object, and then rest. So that's obviously the third step, is to translate it. So the hardest part of an indirect statement is differentiating the subject from the object, because they'll both be in the same case. So take your time translating the sentence, take your time, make sure that you mark up the sentence before you translate it. And if it's not making sense, try swapping the subject accusative and the object accusative, right? So she said that her mother gave her roses. That makes a lot more sense than she said that the roses gave her mother, if that makes sense. So if it's not making sense, maybe you've got the subject accusative and the object accusative mixed up. Also remember to double check the tense of the infinitive in case it's a different tense from the head verb. So sometimes this is probably the other tricky part about indirect statements, is that if the head verb is in the past tense, the infinitive might be in the present, but it doesn't really make sense for us to translate it that way. It's probably easier for us to translate it with tense agreement, right? So rather than she said that she goes to the market, it makes a lot more sense in English to say she said that she went to the market. However, if the infinitive is in the future, then that does make a big difference, right? She said that she will go to the market is very different from she said that she went to the market. So it's always good to be aware of what tense your infinitive is in. And that's it. That's everything that you need to know on a basic level about indirect statements. If you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below, and I will try to get back to you. But wale and have a good day. Thank you.